Everyone, this is Ashley Ellenboss with Skyhouse Herb School and Apothecary, and today we are going to be looking at the connection between the moon phases and herbs. And this is a super exciting topic for me because I love the plants and I love learning about astrology, the moon cycles, and we all know intuitively how the moon cycles and the astrology affects us. But did you know that it also affects the plants so deeply and intimately? And if you want to really understand herbal medicine, you really have to understand how this planet works and how the tides of the moon and the tides of the air, the tides of the earth, I'll tell you more about them, how they affect the plants. Because yes, you can buy your herbs, at a local herb shop. Very cool. You can buy your herbs online from a farm somewhere. But the best way to get to know herbs and to be a really good herbalist, in my opinion, is to get to know the plants as they're growing outside. I'm pointing here because this is my window, which is my outside land. You can see my garden there. We just finished it. It's kind of peeking out over there. So get to know the plants and you will get to understand their medicines. Okay. So in this series, what we're going to cover today is an overview. What are the lunar tides? What are the lunar cycles? How do they affect us? How do they affect the plants? We'll look at general growing considerations. So what do you need to know in order to grow herbs in the optimal way and harvest them in the optimal way? Then in the other classes, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the first half of the lunar cycle. That's from the new moon all the way up to the full moon. Everything that happens in there, we'll look at that in more depth. In the third episode, we'll look at the second half of the cycle, where we'll look at the whole full moon to back to the new moon. So that whole waning side. The first half is the waxing. Then you have the waning. We'll explore all of the ways that plants interact with that phase of the moon cycle there. And in the very final one, we'll talk really specifically about herbs and how do the herbs match up with those cycles and also with the astrology. So it's going to be a really exciting series. I am excited to dive in. So, okay, the first thing I wanted to say is that we all understand, well, I guess maybe I shouldn't assume. I want to talk a little bit about the cycles of the moon and the tides and the way these tides affect all living things. And this is a really cool book that you might be interested in. Especially if you're interested in gardening, growing herbs. If you're taking our Roots and Spheres course, this is going to be maybe some really helpful information for you as well to understand the influence of the moon on the plants themselves. It's called Planetary Planting by Luis Riat. This is a book from like the 1980s, but it holds up. It's really good. So let me read this to you. Seeing is believing, and we must concede the effect of the moon upon the tides, for it certainly can be seen in large bodies of water at least. But what of air tides? Until I began my research, I did not know that these tides existed, but they are, and they do, and they occur in the air surrounding the earth as well as in bodies of water. Though such tides cannot be seen, they take place just as regularly as water tides, and they are measurable. The tides in the air are similar to those in the ocean. At the surface of the earth, the speed of these tides, called lunar winds, is approximately 1/20th of a mile per hour. Yes, they are too low to be felt, but scientists detect them by studying variations in weather statistics. And just as with water tides, high and low tides in the air come twice daily. There are even high stages which are considered to be equivalent to the ocean's spring tide. So here we'll talk about this. So the tides of the ocean, we all know, well, the way that I learned this is I used to be into surfing. Was I good at it? No, I was a terrible surfer and I almost died a few times. So that's for another episode. But I love the ocean and I love watching the tides. And so I spent a lot of time in Costa Rica. I spent a year in Australia and I spent a time around a lot of surfers and I was in the water a lot trying to perfect my surfing. And if you're a surfer, you really have to know the way that the tides, high tide and low tide especially, but also full moon and new moon tides also affect. So you have these larger cycles of the full moon and the new moon and their effect on these tidal waters. And then within a day, you have these high and low tides that are also affected by the moon. So, what's interesting to note here is that when the sun and moon pull at right angles, as they do when the moon is in its first and third quarters, the tides do not rise as high as they usually do. These lower tides are called neap tides. Furthermore, scientists have now discovered that there are also earth tides. A team of scientists from Columbia University revealed in 1970 they had made a detailed measurement of the earth tides of the United States. They found that the land rose and fell an average of 12 inches twice each day. Earth tides are caused in the same way as tides in the ocean, by the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun. And then it goes on and on. But these tidal winds, these earth tides, and these water tides all affect not only how plants grow, but how we grow. And if you think about our bodies as being mostly made of water, plant bodies are made mostly of water. That every time we have a stronger gravitational pull, our waters rise up. And if you think about the more metaphorical energy of water as being our emotional body, that means that our emotions are tending to rise and feel fuller. There's higher expressions of emotion around those higher tides, or we could say around the full moon, right? Especially. And we've seen this in statistics that in emergency room centers and in hospitals, they have a higher incident of emergency room visits around the 3 days around the full moon. And if you talk to any nurses or anybody that works in urgent care, they'll tell you, yes, they hire more staff, they're more fully stocked on the full moons because people act a little more lunatic. Their emotions are a little higher. They're also more at risk for accidents because we're a little bit more high-minded or a little bit more full of ourselves. And in yoga, in traditional yoga, in the Ashtanga method, you don't practice headstands or handstands on the full moon because you're more prone to injury and you're more prone to pushing it. So they even say in Ashtanga yoga, it's better to actually not even practice yoga, take a break on the full moon because of this possibility. So I think that's an interesting thing to note how we see this happening in the modern day, and it was also noticed by the ancient yogis. So, did you also know that the effect of the moon can be seen in the chemical composition of plants? This is super interesting. I was doing some research and I found an article it's called, the article's name is Lunar Influence Understanding Chemical Variation and Seasonal Impacts on Botanicals. And this is from the Herbalgram journal. And this was published in, let's see, it was issue 85. It doesn't say. So I can look this up for you if you're interested. Maybe I'll include it in the description. But let me read to you this. So they're talking here about how the effect of the moon can play a role in the amount of compounds that we find in plants and higher and lower amounts. So this is something that was really interesting. Research on St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum, one of the top 10 herbal retail products in top 10 herbal products in retail sales in the United States, has shown seasonal variation and differences due to cultivation location. Levels of hypericin and pseudohypericin, the compounds which to commercial products are considered standardized, are found to vary between 100 parts per million to 5,000 parts per million throughout the season between winter and summer. So that makes sense, right? Like, when the plants aren't completely mature. But what we find here is that in ancient traditional practices, Hypericum or St. John's wort was always harvested on the summer solstice. So it was always harvested at a very specific moment of the solar pull, and ideally you would have an even stronger harvest if you harvested it around the full moon, if the full moon happened to land around the summer solstice. So that's really interesting here. There was also, they have this here. It says, in some cases, the moon has been specifically implicated for its potential effects on plants. Zerker observed the rhythmic variations of Meopsis anemi a major tree species in Rwanda, and found that seed germination rates showed significant differences in seeds planted during the full moon or during the new moon. His study also found that the speed of germination, rate of germination, and average height and growth rate of seedlings showed better results and larger seedlings if the seeds were sown before the full moon. The phenomena of lunar effects of patterns on seed germination and initial growth rate has been documented for numerous species. And so they talk along again with the fact that trees swell and shrink based on the tides and the effect of the lunar cycles. They go on to talk about how this is kind of interesting. Let me read this one. So, this was about 15 years ago. Gunter Klein first presented the hypothesis of an exogenous rhythm. So, that's an external rhythm rather than an endogenous oscillator. So, an internal rhythm found both in humans and mammals and also in plants. From his experiments, he concluded that the rhythmic leaf movements of bean seedlings grown in constant conditions were regulated by the tidal forces of the changing position of the moon in relation to Earth. Then Barlow analyzed Klein's work and found a correlation between leaf movements and tidal forces, and together with new repetitive studies, his data supported Klein's hypothesis that there's an oscillation cycle in plants and their leaf movements with the tides and the pull of the moon. So again, whenever I see these studies on plants or on people, it makes my head go, of course, because we're connected. We're connected. We are just as much organic creatures of this planet as the plants outside. So if the plants have these rhythmic oscillating cycles, so do we. And if you track your own lunar cycles and watch how your moods change, how your creative cycles change throughout the lunar cycle, you'll see this correlation. And it's just brilliant. It's so cool. I get so excited about this. I wanted to mention a few other things because the study and the history of astrology and herbalism and their connection is something that is very, very ancient. We've seen this through places in ancient Greek, Roman, Indian, Egyptian, and Islamic medicine. All of them correlated the experience of the cosmos, this larger cosmology, and the planets, and their effects on our bodies and our health, and also on the plants. But it wasn't until around the Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th centuries, that a lot of these ancient Greek texts were translated, and Arabic texts were translated into Latin, which were then able to be read by the common person. And then we started to see around the Middle Ages this huge renaissance of using the planetary cycles and influences on how we understand disease patterns, pathology, and also medicines and plants. This was when we start to see the work of Culpeper, the work of Paracelsus. All of these start to really, these great thinkers and early, you could call them chemists, really started to see the connection and make these connections between the plants and the planets. And we see, again, we see a lot of texts come about during the Middle Ages, also a lot of Druid medicine, looking at the use of tree medicines and a lot of things in old Europe or old European medicine. They also started to really take in ancient Greek astrology and blend that in with their understanding of a more, I would say, pagan, you could call it, or just a more nature-based understanding of plant medicine and their uses. Okay, now I want to give you one example that I just thought was really cool of how the ancients, how their work and how they saw the plants and the planets and how this led to laws that were placed further along in history. So Pliny the Elder, he was a great naturalist. He was an author of many, many books on the cosmos and also of plants and medicines. And so he recommended that Roman farmers pick their fruits for market on the full moon. So at the full moon, he said, if you pick your plants for the market, they will be at their heaviest. And this is good because a lot of the produce was weighed, and that was how the price was determined. But then he recommended pick at the new moon for personal consumption, as that fruit would store better. And we now know, because it has less water in it, less water weight, it's going to store better. So they were using this back in 23 to 79 common era. So, thousands of years ago, they were using these moon understandings of the way that water affected plants, plant growth, and weight. Also, Pliny recommended that lumber trees only be cut at the new moon. And then Louis the 14th, King Louis the 14th of France, later on, centuries later, he passed a law saying that the felling of wood can only happen during the waning moon, because he also saw that as the waxing moon, the fluids build, it's harder to cut the trees because they're more plump, they're more full. But as the trees start to put their energies down into the roots, and as the fluids start to go down into the earth, that it's easier to fell the trees, they're easier to carry, and they dry a lot faster. Brilliant, right? So using this, and we see this in commerce across the world. Many traditional cultures understand that if you're going to be making things out of wood, when do you harvest them? When you're going to be picking things for trade, when do you pick them? So this is nothing new. All the things that we're going to be looking at in this series is very ancient knowledge. And I think that's a really exciting piece. Now, what I'm going to do is move over now to some slides to give you some images of what it looks like to see what's happening in the plants above ground and below ground according to the moon cycles. So I'm going to share my screen right here, and we will go to our slideshow from the beginning. But we will not share this one because that is not the correct one. Let me go to today's share. Okay. This is where we want to be. Okay, so from the beginning, we will start here. The connection between moon phases and herbs. And, again, I just love this idea that, and I love these old images too in the ancient world. So here's a great picture of here's the Earth as it's moving through the equinox cycles. Here's the sun in the middle. You can see the tilt of the Earth, and here's all the signs. All of the signs in the sky that the sun, or really we see that the sun's moving through it, but as the Earth moves through the signs. So we've been doing this, for thousands of years. The lessons from the moon, I think, are really wonderful for us to consider a little bit more deeply, because the solar cycles are very large. These are our seasonal cycles, but the smaller cycles of the moon give us something, I think, a little bit more tangible to hold on to, and we can see their effects a little bit more quickly. This is the micro macrocosmic work that we can follow each and every month. And I have really found personally that by following the moon cycles, I deplete myself a lot less often, because I know that as the moon is starting to wane and the energy of the moon is starting to become a little bit more in its restful phase, that I too need to take breaks, that I too need to rest. And often what I'll do is, I'll take the days of the new moon off from work, from recording. When I was taking clients, I would just close my whole schedule for the 2 or 3 days around the new moon. And I found that was really helpful to help me really get the most out of these moon cycles and find that deep rest and replenishment to set me up for the next month ahead. Now, I don't know if you guys know about this, but this is a great calendar. It's called the Wee Moon. I'm going to hold it up on the screen here so if you can see my camera. It's called the Wee Moon, or the Women. And what it does is it gives you what sign the moon is in and the phase of the moon for each and every day. It also tells you about eclipses that are happening. And also it tells you days where there's really cool aspects. So if you're into astrology and you want sort of like something daily to track, it also gives you a year at a glance for each sign. There's poetry, there's beautiful images in in these books. And it's just, I really like having paper calendars because it just makes life feel more real. And if everything disappeared, which that happened to me once, I actually have like a paper trail of what's going on in my life. So I would consider maybe purchasing the Wee Moon. I know it's halfway through the year, so well, actually more than halfway through the year. So you may want to wait for the 2023 calendar, which is already out now. I got an email, so you can buy that through Wee Moon. The website is Mother Ink, Mother Tongue Ink. So you can just Google Mother Tongue Ink Wee Moon calendar. And that's a really great way to use and to really follow these rhythms. Now, plant growth again is a lot like human growth. When the new moon, which is the dark moon, when everything is at rest, that is a great time where, that's really kind of, I would say, the neutral time. It's the time of rest. It's the time where everything is neutral. It's the beginning, where a lot of people say it's really the beginning of the moon, of the lunar cycle. So we can see here in this picture that we have the above ground plants. We can see that the energy above the ground is building. And if you think about it, again, at the full moon, that's when all the water is being pulled upward. So everything that is above ground in that first light phase of the lunar cycle is going to be activated. So you want to seed things, you want to plant things before the new moon, right? You want to plant them when in the dark phase, when it can pull the energy down. So like right before the new moon, you might want to plant things. And then you'll start to feel, as the energy of the moon starts to pull up, the growth will start to be pulled upwards as well. And then harvesting also is different, right? So during the light phase, when all of the succulent oils and everything is everything is above ground, when the fruits are getting full with water and moisture, that's when you want to harvest them. You want to harvest them right around the full moon is ideal for all of the above ground parts. Now let's tip it to the dark phase. You can see that the light of the moon is starting to diminish as we go back towards the dark phase in the new moon. So this is when the energy is being pulled back down into the roots. This is a really good time for harvesting roots when we feel that gentle pull. It's also a really good time to transplant things. So if you have to move a plant, this is even from pot to pot. If you're transplanting your house plants, during that dark phase, when the energy is drawing downward, will help the plant get established in that new pot a lot faster. And that's also true for when you're transplanting things outside. So try to do it during the dark phase. If we think about the correlation between the spring to summer and then summer to winter, we could also note that really the best time to plant trees or big bushes is really during the fall, because that's going to, oops, sorry, jumping slides. That's going to really allow the roots to establish themselves before they go into that winter phase. This is also when we plant bulbs. So if you're going to be planting daffodils and tulips, best time to do this is in that fall season so that the bulbs and roots can become really firmly established, right? It makes sense. Sowing seeds and harvesting, this is just another image. 2 days before the new moon, plant short and extra long germinating seeds. Most vegetables and herbs are going to fall in this place. Then we have the first 7 days. This is a balanced increase in rate of root and leaf growth. So we're going to have equal pulling downward and upward in those first 7 days, which is great for letting something new get established. Then in the second 7 days of that first part of the cycle, we see an increased leaf growth rate. So we have, again, more of that upward action, and we see that lunar gravity becoming increased. Then at the full moon, we can transplant short and extra long germinating seedlings from flats into beds, right? Remember, we're tipping over into when the root phase is going to be activated. So we can transplant things right during that, like right after the full moon. This is also where I personally harvest my above ground parts, my aerial leaves and flowers. Then we can see in the third 7 days of the lunar cycle, increased root growth rate. We've got that lunar gravity really pulling downward. And then in that last fourth of the lunar cycle, those last 7 days, as we head towards the new moon, We see a decreased rate in root and leaf growth if this is more of a resting period. So, again, resting for plants, and I would say also resting for people. So, I think that's just so important. So, think about these as you're going through your own calendar making. Like if you're planning events with friends, you're more up and out there and active things, plan those during the first half of the lunar cycle. For more restful, meditative, retreat type of activities, plan those then during that second half of the darker phase of the cycle. Now, this next slide has a lot of information on it. So I don't, you don't have to memorize this, but I think it's what's going to be helpful for you as an herbalist, especially if you're taking the Roots and Spheres course, is to understand the correlation between the different signs and the elements. Now, I did a course on looking at the qualities and the elements, hot, cold, damp, and dry. And so you might want to look at that. That's on my YouTube channel. It's also on all my podcasts. So look for that series where you can then listen back to understand what is the fire element, the earth element, the water element, how do those show up in the body, what herbs are corresponding to those. That's all going to be in that last series that I did. But for you guys right now, I think what's going to be helpful to understand is that when we can pair the astrological signs with the earth elements, or I should say the elements here on earth. So we have Cancer, Pisces, and Scorpio. They fall into water signs. We have Taurus, Capricorn, and Virgo over here in our earth signs. And then we have, I don't know why my slides jump. That is so annoying. I apologize. Then we have, I'm just not going to touch anything. Okay, so then we have our air signs, Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra, our fire signs, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. Now, each of these, when the moon travels through the water signs, there are particular activities that are really good. So this is a good time for harvesting all of our leafy, watery things, our above ground materials for making herbal preparations like tinctures, making a menstruum for a cordial, right? These are really good times for harvesting and even for drying, because again, a lot of the energy is in those upper parts. The earth signs is a good time for harvesting and working with roots, because these signs are, again, ideal. They're more about what is happening on the earth and below. So these would be, think about harvesting your burdock root, your dandelion root. Air signs, these are considered to be fairly barren and dry. However, Libra is associated with flowers. So for harvesting flowers and making flower preparations can actually be very good to do when the moon is in the sign of Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra. Otherwise, these are not the ideal times for making plant preparations and harvesting. Now, if it happens, here's the thing, guys, is that there's a lot of nuance here, because what happens if the full moon lands in the sign of Libra? Do you not harvest? But it's a full moon. You can, but just notice that you might have a drier harvest, that your plants might not be quite as, they might just not be as full and, maybe as plump as they would be as if it fell in another sign. Our fire signs are the removal signs. So it's a really good time for weeding. So when the moon is in the signs of Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, this is a good time to really go out, visit your garden, take stock, weed things out, pull things out. Things are going to be it's going to be a really good time for making way for new things. This is the exception here is going to be the fourth quarter. This is good for preservation. So you could harvest during that fourth quarter of the moon phase. When their moon is in a fire sign, because it's going to help dry things out a little bit more quickly. So again, there's a lot of nuance here, and the best way to learn is by practicing. Often what I do, this is something I used to always be like, okay, on this day, because the moon is in this sign, it's going to be really good for harvesting. Instead, what I did was did it retroactively, is I would harvest things and then I would say, oh, I wonder what sign the moon is in. And then I would say, oh, no wonder why things are really dry. Or wow, no wonder why the weeds are coming up super easy today. It's because all of the, we're in the first half of the lunar cycle. Everything's above ground and I can rip those roots out. And hey, it's a fire sign. So the roots are really dried out. So I can just pull them out super easy, right? So again, you don't have to, it's not like I think you are limited by the way that the signs work through the lunar cycles, but instead, I would think about using it as a way to understand why things are the way they are. Okay, I hope that's helpful and perhaps interesting to you. I'm going to be posting my next talk on the following Monday, where we will look at that first half of the phase of our lunar cycle in a little bit more depth. We'll also talk about some plants. So let me know what you think. Please comment, please subscribe if you're interested in learning more. Please share this with a friend. And as always, all of your comments are so appreciated. I love knowing that you're out there listening and that you're engaged in this material. And if you have any questions about anything I said or any comments or feedback, please, please, please add them in. So thank you so much again. It's always a pleasure to be here with you. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. And take a look at the moon, see where it is today in the sky. And yeah, see if you can feel how your body is being affected by those lunar poles. All right, everyone, take care.